One of the most terrifying and widely used innovations throughout history is torture. Although still practiced in secret, there was a time when public execution reached the height of popularity and savagery, where torture was used to extract information, punish criminals, or inflict harm on those citizens who had not acted in an exemplary manner based on the dubious morals of the time, and that era was the Middle Ages. However, some of those methods used in the Middle Ages were grotesque and disgusting and should never be remembered again. Welcome to History Facts. Today, I'm going to show you some of the most ruthless torture methods of the Middle Ages. But enough talking, let's dive into it. The Judas Cradle. The Judas Cradle, also known as the Judas Chair, was a cruel Italian invention that forced prisoners to sit on a pyramid-shaped seat after lowering them by ropes until the tip of this perverse device was inserted into their anus or vagina. As soon as the victims sat down, the torturers exerted intense pressure that caused the orifice to stretch and permanently damage. As a result, the victims succumbed to the terrible tearing of muscle tissues that eventually became infected in most cases. To ensure that the victims suffered, torturers often added extra weight to the victims to facilitate the process, resulting in a painful death by impalement. The Breaking Wheel. The breaking wheel was one of the most grotesque torture devices on Earth. It consisted of a giant wagon wheel to which criminals were tied and beaten in the extremities with an iron club. Since there was no supporting point, the holes in the wheel allowed the limbs to break very easily. The scariest part about this device was that death was not instantaneous. Some of the victims even survived for several days before dying from their mortal wounds in the most inhumane way possible. The Iron Chair. Our ancestors liked to turn any chair into a cruel, lethal weapon. That was the case of the Iron Chair, an invention that became the terror of thousands of criminals and innocents. The Iron Chair consisted of a chair filled with hundreds of sharp spikes on which the prisoners had to sit. The torturers would progressively tighten their iron restraints as soon as the prisoners sat down, causing the painful spikes to penetrate deep into their flesh. This painful method of torture could last for hours or even days, as the spikes never reached the vital organs. On many occasions, the Iron Chair was also used as an instrument of psychological torture, leading victims to confess their crimes as they watched the device punish other prisoners. Torture Coffin. The torture coffin was one of the most feared devices during the medieval period. After the accused were locked in a coffin where they were completely immobile, the victims were often publicly displayed to be humiliated and abused by the locals, who were responsible for making the criminals repent for their actions, which, as we all know, never gave results. The prisoner's time to remain inside the coffin could be completely different depending on the crime committed. However, some crimes, such as blasphemy, were punishable by death. The Iron Spider. Can you imagine a more painful method of torture than ripping the breasts off a living being? Allow me to introduce you to the Iron Spider, an ancient instrument of torture used on women accused of adultery, self-abortion, or blasphemy, and in interrogations. The Iron Spider contained 4 claws used to slowly and painfully rip out the breasts. If the woman did not die, the instrument was sure to scar the victim's mind and status, leaving a mark that not even all modern medicine would be able to remove. Despite being invented to deliver justice, most of the trials exercised by the Iron Spider were not even justified and led to many women becoming victims of this terrifying device after being accused of being witches by their neighbors. The only evidence the state needed? Only the testimonies of a few superstitious villagers willing to punish anyone suspected of witchcraft with a painful death. Head Crusher. The head crusher was an instrument of torture intended to burst the bones of the skull. To set this evil machine in motion, it was only necessary to place the victim's chin on the lower bar of the device while the cap was pushed down by a screw. As soon as the instrument was activated, the head crusher shattered the victim's tooth sockets before completely breaking their jaw, brain, and skull. Even if the torturer decided to stop the device before killing the victim, its consequences were so catastrophic that they permanently damaged the prisoner's facial structure, leaving their victims forever disfigured. The saw. Before being used to cut wood, saws were used every day to cut humans as if they were made of bread. Whether it was for torture or executions, there's a reason why saws were one of the most feared instruments of our ancestors. Before the cutting began, the victim was held upside down, allowing the blood to rush down to his head. Then the torturer would start to cut them between the legs slowly. Since the blood remained in the head throughout the execution, the victim remained conscious during most of the cutting. This prolonged their suffering until the saw reached the middle of the body and caused their death. The rack. One of the most famous torture devices of the Middle Ages, the rack was a wooden platform with rollers at both ends. After the victims were tied hand and foot to these rollers, the tortured would spin these devices, causing the victim's body to stretch and the limbs to dislocate. The worst part about this device is that it could also be used to dismember its criminals, leading to the victims facing a tragic and painful death. According to historians, it was also one of the most common torture methods employed by the Spanish Inquisition. Each of these torture sessions were counted with a scribe who recorded every word and gesture of the victims. In other words, there are records detailing the suffering of each of the victims of this Machiavellian device, which hopefully will never be used again. Knee splitter. The knee splitter was another of the Inquisition's favorite methods of torture. This device consisted of two spiked wooden blocks placed in front of and behind the victim's knee. The blocks were connected by two gigantic screws that rotated and locked against each other, causing the victim's knees to be wholly destroyed, and the victim was unable to walk again. Depending on the nature of the crime and the prisoner's state, the number of spikes placed on the blocks could vary from 3 to 20. Another reason why you should never mess with the Spanish Inquisition. Torture with rats. If you've ever watched Game of Thrones, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with this method of torture. If not, I hope you don't have a phobia of rodents. Rat torture is one of the most significant demonstrations of how terrifying and perverse the human mind can be, and was widely used in medieval Germany and ancient China. It consisted of immobilizing a prisoner and tying them on a flat surface while a rat was placed on their stomach next to a bucket or metal container to trap the animal. After this, the container was gradually heated. Since the rat could not get out through the metal bucket, they eventually became desperate and tried to make their way out through the only available path. That's right, they would bite and scratch their way through the stomach. This process could last for hours, during which the victim would agonize before facing one of the most gruesome deaths in the history of the Middle Ages. Thumbscrew. The thumbscrew was a method of torture used in the late medieval and early modern European periods due to its practicality and effectiveness. Its design consisted of two metal plates on which the victim's thumb was placed and then tightened with a screw. Despite its simple operation, the thumbscrew was capable of shattering the bones of the hand and feet with extreme ease, while its metal tips pierced the nails and skin of its victims. It was one of the torture devices most beloved by torturers, since it rarely caused victims to die or pass out, allowing pain to be inflicted for long periods. So yeah, resting was not an option. That's all for now. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video with another interesting topic.